March 27, 1942. English Channel. An obsolete destroyer steams through darkness toward the French coast. HMS Campbeltown, once USS Buchanan in the American Navy, handed to Britain under Lend-Lease, now stripped down, lightened, and converted into something no warship has ever been before, a floating bomb. Her bow is packed with 4.5 tons of high explosives encased in concrete and steel. 2 of her 4 funnels have been removed. The remaining 2 are cut at an angle to resemble a German destroyer. She flies the German naval ensign. 611 men are aboard, 265 commandos from No. 2 Commando, and other units, the rest Royal Navy crew. Following behind in the darkness, 18 small motor launches carry the remaining commandos. Their target, St Nazaire, the only port on the Atlantic coast with a dry dock large enough to service Germany's most powerful battleship. Their plan, sail into the heavily defended harbor disguised as German vessels, ram Campbeltown into the massive dock gates at full speed, evacuate the crew, let the Germans swarm aboard to inspect their prize, then detonate the hidden explosives 12 hours later. The Germans have no idea that their enemy is approaching from the sea flying their own flag, about to turn an obsolete destroyer into a weapon they will never see coming. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what's at stake. On May 24, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck was heading for St Nazaire after sinking HMS Hood in the Denmark Strait. She needed repairs. She was damaged. The Normandie Dock at St Nazaire, built in 1932 to house the massive ocean liner SS Normandie, was the only dry dock in the Atlantic large enough to accommodate her. The British hunted Bismarck down and sank her before she reached port, but the message was clear. If Germany's newest battleship, Tirpitz, sister ship to Bismarck, ever broke into the Atlantic and got damaged, there was only one place she could go for repairs: St Nazaire. Take out that dock, and Tirpitz would have to stay in Norwegian fjords. She couldn't risk the Atlantic. No dock meant no repairs. No repairs meant no operations. Britain's Atlantic convoys, bringing food and supplies from America, would be safe in the most powerful surface raider Germany possessed. The Normandie Dock wasn't just infrastructure. It was a strategic hinge on which Germany's Atlantic battleship threat depended. Destroy it, and you crippled German naval power projection for years. The man commanding the naval force was Commander Robert Ryder, 34 years old, experienced, and unflinching. The commando force was led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, No. 2 Commando, a man who understood combined operations and trusted his troops to fight through chaos. Commanding HMS Campbeltown was Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, the man who would have to steer the destroyer through 5 miles of estuary under fire and ram her into the dock gates at precisely the right angle and speed. The plan was audacious. Some called it suicidal. Combined Operations Headquarters, under Lord Louis Mountbatten, had examined every option. The RAF couldn't bomb the dock without massive civilian casualties and lacked the precision to guarantee destruction. The Special Operations Executive determined they couldn't smuggle enough explosives into St Nazaire to do the job. A conventional naval bombardment would be detected miles away and blown out of the water before reaching range. The only option left was a commando raid using a ship as the weapon. They needed a destroyer to ram the gates, but destroyers draw too much water to cross the shallow sandbanks in the Loire estuary, unless you lighten one. So they gutted Campbeltown, removed compartments, stripped out guns, cut down funnels, covered her decks with armor plates to protect the commandos. Then they packed her bow with delayed action explosives designed to go off hours after impact, giving the crew time to evacuate and the Germans time to think they'd captured an intact enemy vessel. This was an attack. This was a Trojan Horse. The British convoy left Falmouth, Cornwall, at 1,400 hours on March 26, 1942. 3 destroyers in the middle lane. HMS Campbeltown surrounded by 16 motor launches and 2 smaller craft. The journey across the channel to the French coast would take over 24 hours, covering roughly 400 miles of open water. They sailed in broad daylight, hoping to avoid suspicion, but encountered 2 French fishing trawlers en route. Both crews were taken off and the ship sunk. They couldn't risk anyone reporting the convoy's composition and heading. By evening, they reached a position 65, nautical miles off St Nazaire, and turned toward the estuary. The escorting destroyers, HMS Atherstone and HMS Tyndale, stayed out at sea as backup. The rest pushed on. Campbelltown raised a German naval ensign. The motor launches followed. At 2,330 hours on March 27th, RAF bombers appeared overhead. 5 squadrons, 62 aircraft, Wellingtons and Whitleys, ordered to bomb St Nazaire and create a diversion, but the weather was against them. Cloud, cover blanketed the port. Only 4 aircraft managed to bomb anything. The rest circled uselessly or dropped bombs one at a time to avoid civilian casualties, creating a bizarre, sporadic bombardment that didn't distract anyone. It did the opposite. It made the Germans suspicious. Captain Zuersee Karl Conrad Mech, commanding the 22nd Naval Flak Brigade, was responsible for St. Nazaire's air defenses. He watched the RAF bombers dropping single bombs sporadically and thought something was wrong. This wasn't a normal raid. At midnight on March 28th, he issued a warning. There might be a parachute landing in progress. At 0100 hours, he ordered all anti-aircraft guns to cease firing and searchlights to be extinguished. He didn't want to give the RAF navigation beacons. He placed every unit on heightened alert. Harbor defense companies manned their posts. The crew of the guard ship, a spare Brecher minesweeper, stood ready. Gun crews on top of the massive submarine pens climbed to their positions. Mech had no idea what was coming, but he knew something was. An estuary lookout boat reported seeing activity out at sea. Mech began to suspect a landing attempt. He was right, but he was looking in the wrong direction. At 0030 hours on March 28th, the British convoy crossed the shoals at the mouth of the Loire estuary. Campbelltown scraped bottom twice, but pulled free both times. They were 8 minutes from the dock gates when, at 0122 hours, every searchlight on both banks of the estuary snapped on. The entire convoy was illuminated. A German signal light blinked a challenge. Identify yourselves. Motor Gunboat 314, carrying Commander Ryder and Lieutenant Colonel Newman, responded using a captured German recognition code obtained during a raid in Norway. The message said they were German torpedo boats returning from patrol and under attack by British aircraft. Request permission to proceed. It bought them a few seconds. A shore battery fired a few warning shots. Campbelltown and MGB 314 replied with a signal. Ship being fired upon by friendly forces. For a brief, precious moment, the Germans hesitated. But they didn't stop. At 0128 hours, with the convoy 1 mile from the dock gates, Beatty gave the order. Lower the German flag. Raise the white ensign. Open fire. Every gun in the convoy opened up simultaneously. The Germans responded instantly. 43 anti-aircraft guns ranging from 20 millimeters to 40 millimeters, positioned on top of the submarine pens, and along the quays, swiveled and fired. Heavy coastal artillery joined in. The water erupted with shell splashes and tracer fire. Campbelltown was hit multiple times. The first helmsman was killed. The second was wounded. Beatty took the wheel himself. Shells punched through the thin armor plating. Men were cut down on deck. But Campbelltown kept coming. At 0134 hours, 3 minutes behind schedule, HMS Campbeltown struck the southern gate of the Normandie Dock at 19 knots. The impact drove her 33 feet onto the gate structure, crushing 36 feet of her bow forward with a hidden explosive charge. The ship shuddered, metal screaming, and came to rest wedged firmly into the massive steel caisson. Beatty had done it. The bomb was in place. Now the Commandos had to get off the ship, complete their demolition tasks, and evacuate before the Germans overwhelmed them. Commandos poured off Campbelltown within seconds of impact. They had rehearsed this for months. Assault teams went first, clearing gun positions and securing routes. Demolition teams followed, carrying explosives to destroy dock machinery, pump houses, and the winding gear that operated the gate mechanisms. Protection teams armed with Thompson submachine guns covered them. The plan called for systematic destruction of every piece of equipment that made the dry dock operational. Destroy the pumps, and you couldn't drain the dock. Destroy the winding houses, and you couldn't open the gates. Destroy the underground fuel storage tanks, and you denied the enemy resources. Every target mattered. Some teams succeeded completely. Captain Donald Roy and his assault troop used scaling ladders to reach gun emplacements on top of pump houses and knocked them out with grenades. Other demolition teams moved through chaos and heavy fire to place charges on machinery and blow it apart. But the motor launches carrying the bulk of the Commandos never made it. The MLs were wooden-hulled boats 112 feet long, carrying two 20mm Oerlikon guns and crammed with men and equipment. They had auxiliary fuel tanks strapped to their decks to extend their range. Under German fire, they became floating death traps. Shells ripped through thin mahogany hulls. Fuel tanks exploded. One by one, the launches were hit, set ablaze, or blown apart. ML-192 was destroyed. ML-262 sunk. ML-267 crippled. Out of 16 motor launches, only a handful survived the gauntlet. Some managed to land their troops at the Old Mole jetty, but German fire recaptured the position almost immediately. The Commandos who did get ashore found themselves cut off, surrounded, and fighting for survival in the narrow streets of St Nazaire. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, who could have stayed aboard MGB 314 and directed from safety, was one of the first ashore. He directed mortar fire onto a gun position that was slaughtering his men. He rallied scattered commando groups and led them into the old town. When he realized evacuation by sea was impossible, he made a decision: fight through to the countryside and escape overland. About 100 commandos were still ashore. Newman and Major William Copeland led a charge across a bridge raked by machine gun fire and pushed into the new town. They moved through narrow streets, fighting house to house, trying to break through the German cordon. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. Eventually, they were surrounded. When their ammunition was exhausted, they surrendered. Not all were captured. 5 commandos reached neutral Spain and eventually made it back to England through the escape networks. The rest, 215 men, became prisoners of war. Out on the river, Commander Ryder aboard MGB 314 went to check that Campbeltown was firmly wedged in place. He looked around for other boats to evacuate the commandos, but saw only 7 or 8 motor launches burning. The landing points had been recaptured by the Germans. There was nothing more he could do. He ordered MGB 314 to head out to sea. German searchlights tracked them. Shells hit them at least 6 times. They made smoke to cover their escape and picked up ML-270, the only other boat that made it out. Behind them, St Nazaire burned. Commandos fought in the streets. And HMS Campbeltown sat wedged in the dock gates, her hidden cargo ticking down. But not everyone understood what they were fighting. Sergeant Thomas Durant of No. 1 Commando was manning the aft Lewis gun on Motor Launch 306. As they fought their way upriver, Durant engaged every gun position and searchlight he could see. He was wounded but stayed at his gun. ML-306 reached open water, but was chased down by the German torpedo boat Jaguar. At short range, Jaguar opened fire. Durant returned fire, aiming for the bridge, trying to kill the German officers. He was hit again and again, but he refused to leave his gun. The German commander asked for their surrender. Durant kept firing. He expended drum after drum of ammunition, hitting Jaguar repeatedly until the ML was finally boarded. Durant died of his wounds. The German commander, recognizing extraordinary courage when he saw it, recommended him for the Victoria Cross. It was granted. Durant is the only soldier to receive the Victoria Cross on the recommendation of an enemy officer. Able Seaman William Savage manned a forward 2-pounder gun on MGB 314. He fired continuously during the approach, hitting German positions and covering the smaller boats. Even after they reached open water and the lighter guns fell silent, the heavy coastal artillery kept firing. Savage stayed at his gun. For miles offshore, the last German salvo straddled MGB 314. A shell hit Savage directly. He died instantly, still at his post. He received a posthumous Victoria Cross. His citation recognized not only Savage, but many others, unnamed, in motor launches and gunboats who carried out their duties in entirely exposed positions against enemy fire at very close range. Of the 612 men who undertook the raid, 228 returned to Britain, 169 were killed, 215 became prisoners of war. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty for ramming Campbelltown into the dock under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman for leading the Commandos through impossible odds. Commander Robert Ryder for commanding the naval force and evacuating men under continuous bombardment. Sergeant Thomas Durant and able seaman William Savage, posthumously, for fighting to the death. It was the highest concentration of Victoria Crosses awarded for any single operation of its size. German casualties in the fighting were estimated at around 60 killed and wounded, but the raid wasn't over. The real destruction was still to come. HMS Campbeltown sat wedged in the Normandie Dock gates for the rest of the night and into morning of March 28th. German engineers swarmed over her, inspecting the damage, trying to figure out how to remove her. German officers toured the ship, examining her construction, taking notes. Kriegsmarine officials arrived to assess the wreck. About 40 senior German officers and French dockyard workers were aboard or nearby when, at noon on March 28th, the explosives detonated. The blast was enormous. 4.5 tons of high explosives, packed in concrete and steel, detonated in the confined space of the dock gates. The southern caisson was destroyed. The ship disintegrated. The 40 officers and civilians aboard were killed instantly. The shock wave tore through the dock, collapsing structures, shattering windows across St Nazaire, and killing anyone within lethal radius. 2 tankers in the dock were swept away by the wall of water. German casualties from the explosion totaled over 360 dead. The Normandie Dock, the largest in the world when it was built, was rendered completely unusable. It would remain out of service until 1947. The explosion had a secondary effect the British hadn't planned but welcomed. In the hours after the raid, nervous German troops began firing at anything that moved. French civilians were shot. Organization tote workers were killed by mistake. The Germans were convinced more British commandos were hiding in the town, preparing to blow up more targets. Panic spread. And then, later that afternoon, delayed-action torpedoes left by motor torpedo boat 74 in the old entrance to the basin exploded. More chaos, more casualties. The Germans didn't know how many bombs the British had left behind or where they were. St Nazaire became a city under siege by its own defenders. But there's a deeper story here that explains why this raid succeeded when it should have failed. The Germans at St Nazaire weren't incompetent. Captain Zur C. Meck had placed his forces on alert. His gun crews responded quickly and devastated the British motor launches. His troops recaptured the Old Mole and hunted down the Commandos. He did everything a commander should do, but his defenses were oriented outward toward the sea and sky. He expected attacks from those directions. The RAF had bombed St Nazaire before. British submarines operated off the coast. German doctrine focused on static defense. Heavy guns pointed at known threats, layers of artillery and flak covering the approaches. What they didn't expect was deception. They didn't imagine the British would sail up the Loire flying German flags, answering German recognition signals, pretending to be friendly forces. The moment of hesitation that gave Campbelltown those crucial extra seconds to close the distance was the moment German rigid adherence to procedure collided with British willingness to lie, cheat, and exploit every advantage. The British system encouraged initiative. Beatty didn't wait for orders when the first helmsman was killed. He took the wheel. Newman didn't wait for evacuation when the launches were destroyed. He fought through the streets. The Commandos who made it ashore didn't surrender when surrounded. They fought until their ammunition ran out. Compare that to German doctrine, which demanded strict obedience to the chain of command and adherence to procedure. The Germans were brave. They fought hard. But they fought within a system that prioritized control over adaptability. The raid on St Nazaire wasn't an isolated gamble. It was part of a broader campaign of combined operations raids designed to keep the Germans off balance, tie down troops, and demonstrate that no German-held port was safe. Throughout 1941 and 1942, British commandos raided targets across occupied Europe. Viagso in Norway, Brunival on the French coast, Later, Dieppe, some succeeded, some failed catastrophically. But each one forced the Germans to divert resources, strengthen defenses, and spread their forces thin. St Nazaire was the most successful. It achieved total strategic success with a force of 612 men and one obsolete destroyer. Compare that to what it would have taken to achieve the same result by conventional means. A bombing campaign would have required hundreds of sorties, killed thousands of French civilians, and still might not have destroyed the dock. A conventional naval assault would have needed a fleet and been detected miles away. The Commando raid, for all its human cost, accomplished in one night what months of bombing couldn't have guaranteed. To understand what the Germans experienced, we can look at the aftermath from their perspective. In the morning after the raid, German troops rounded up British prisoners and marched them through the streets. They believed they had won. The British attack had been repulsed. Most of the raiders were dead or captured. HMS Campbeltown was stuck in the dock gates, a trophy. German officers toured the ship, examining her construction, taking photographs. Engineers began planning how to cut her free and salvage her. French dockyard workers were ordered to assist. The German commander of the port inspection team walked through the wreckage, noting the damage, compiling a report. Then, at noon, while he and 39 others were aboard or nearby, the ship exploded. Survivors described the blast as apocalyptic. The entire dock area shook. Buildings collapsed. Men were thrown through the air. Those closest to the ship simply ceased to exist. The Germans hadn't just lost a strategic asset. They'd been humiliated. The British had sailed into their heavily defended port, rammed a bomb into the most important dock in the Atlantic, walked off the ship, and left it ticking like a time bomb in a cartoon. The Germans had swarmed over it, examined it, and never found the explosives because they were encased in concrete and hidden in the bow that was crushed on impact. Even after the explosion, the Germans didn't fully trust that the British were gone. For hours afterward, German troops fired at shadows, killed civilians, and searched frantically for more hidden bombs. The raid also revealed a fundamental truth about asymmetric warfare. The British didn't try to match German strength with equal strength. They didn't send a fleet to bombard St Nazaire. They sent a Trojan Horse disguised as a friendly vessel, crewed by men willing to sail into the mouth of hell for a chance to blow up one dock. They used deception, speed, and surprise to multiply their effectiveness. They turned their weaknesses into strengths. Campbeltown was obsolete, slow, and lightly armed, but those weaknesses made her expendable, which made her perfect for ramming. The motor launches were fragile and vulnerable, but they were fast, maneuverable, and could carry commandos into positions that larger ships couldn't reach. The commandos themselves were lightly armed compared to regular infantry, but they were trained for exactly this kind of raid. Fast insertion, precise demolition, rapid extraction. The Germans had superior numbers, heavier guns, and fortified positions. But those advantages meant nothing when the British attacked from an unexpected direction, using methods the Germans hadn't anticipated. British commando doctrine in 1942 was still evolving, but it emphasized several key principles. Combined arms at the tactical level, naval forces, commandos, and air support working together as a coordinated system. Individual initiative. Junior officers and NCOs empowered to make decisions without waiting for orders from above. Aggression. Hit hard, hit fast, and accept casualties if the objective demanded it. Adaptability. When the plan falls apart, and it always does, improvise. The St Nazaire Raid demonstrated all of these principles. When the motor launches were destroyed, Newman didn't abort. He fought on with the men he had. When Beatty's helmsmen were killed, he took the wheel himself. When evacuation became impossible, the commandos fought their way inland. The Germans at St Nazaire were brave, well-trained, and equipped with powerful weapons. But the system they operated within limited their effectiveness. German coastal defense doctrine relied on static positions, overlapping fields of fire, and layers of artillery covering expected approach routes. It worked well against conventional attacks. It failed against deception and initiative. After the war, the Germans repaired almost every other facility at St Nazaire. The submarine pens were expanded. The harbor was cleared. The port returned to operation. But the Normandie Dock remained out of service until 1947. The damage was so extensive that repair was economically unviable during wartime. The dock gates were destroyed. The pumping machinery was wrecked. The winding houses were blown apart. Even after the war ended, it took 2 years to make the dock operational again. In those 5 years, Tirpitz never risked the Atlantic. She stayed in Norwegian fjords, a threat that never materialized until British bombers sank her in 1944. The strategic objective of the St Nazaire Raid was achieved completely. German battleship operations in the Atlantic were crippled. British convoys sailed with one less existential threat to worry about, and 612 men in wooden boats and one obsolete destroyer had done what fleets and bomber wings couldn't. The raid remains, 82 years later, a textbook example of special operations at their most effective. It combined deception, surprise, and overwhelming violence at the point of attack to achieve results far beyond what the size of the force would suggest. It demonstrated that audacity and initiative could defeat superior numbers and firepower. It proved that the British, even in 1942 when they were losing on almost every front, could strike back and hurt the enemy in ways that mattered strategically. The Germans called St Nazaire Fortress. The British called it a target. And on the night of 27 to 28 March 1942, 611 men in a disguised destroyer and 18 wooden boats proved that no fortress is impregnable when you're willing to sail for the front door, shake hands with the guards, and leave a bomb ticking in the basement. 169 British killed, 215 captured, 360 Germans dead, 1 dry dock destroyed, Tirpitz neutralized as an Atlantic threat, 5 Victoria Crosses awarded. The raid was called the greatest of all. Why? Because 611 men achieved total strategic success by doing what the enemy never imagined, attacking from the expected direction but disguised as a friend, ramming a bomb into the most important target on the Atlantic coast, and walking away while the Germans swarmed over the prize they thought they'd captured. The night of March 28, 1942 proved that Britain, outgunned and outnumbered across Europe, could still strike with precision, courage, and devastating effect. St. Nazaire wasn't just a raid. It was a declaration. Germany could fortify every port, station troops on every beach, and mount guns on every roof. But if the British were willing to disguise a destroyer as a German ship, load it with explosives, and ram it into the one target that mattered most, no amount of concrete and steel could keep them out.